We're going to go live over on YouTube. Good luck.
Entitled Pandemic Pods, Hybrid Learning, and Remote Instruction, Solutions are Perpetuating Inequities. My name is Tiffanie Spencer, and I serve as the Director for Diversity and Community Engagement as part of the College of Education and Social Services at the University of Vermont. And I'm really happy to be with you all today to facilitate this conversation. And we're doing this in conjunction with UVM's continuing and distance education, as well as I mentioned again, the University of Vermont's Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Office, as well as the College of Education and Social Services. Before we continue, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Vermont is located on land which has long served as the site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples for thousands of years and is home of Western Abenaki people. UVM honors, recognizes, and respects these peoples, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters of which we are virtually gathering today. So I just wanted to mention that this is a continuation of an evolution of events that has already taken place that began earlier this summer, that has started with a series called Amazing Grace, and then continued along with Finding Answers Together. And now we are entering into another part of the series that is entitled Beyond Brave Spaces, in which we'll focus on some academic foci of really diving into some racial inequities and how they relate. So I want to start by sharing a little bit of the logistics about the sessions today. As you can see on the webinar screen, we do have a place where you're able to post questions and comments, so please feel free to do this at any time throughout the webinar today. We'd love to have your comments and your questions, and feel free to do this throughout the entire presentation, and we'll talk later about how you might be able to get those questions answered as we continue. And I also do want to mention that the session is being recorded, and for those of you who have RSVP'd, you will be able to receive a link to access the recording. And if you're not sure about if you RSVP'd for the session, you are able to email at diversity@uvm.edu, and we'll be able to send you a link so that you can access the recording. And that hyperlink and that email address will actually be included in the chat box below. And also, we do have some live captions that are occurring right now as I speak, and they will continue throughout the webinar. So now I'll just talk a little bit about the session overview. And today we are going to be having a 45-minute presentation, which will include 3 different panelists. And we do welcome everyone that is joining us via YouTube. And as I mentioned, you will be able to input your questions in the webinar chat box below throughout the presentation. I do want to mention that we do have a lot of folks joining us today, which is really great, but which means we won't be able to get to all of the questions that you ask. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation or after the presentation, don't hesitate to reach out to us, again, at diversity@uvm.edu, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I also want to mention that there will be an opportunity for you to collect a digital badge, and I'll share more about that at the end. And so if you are interested in learning more about that opportunity, again, I'll share more about that at the end. And also, just as a heads up, we will have an evaluation at the end of the webinar, and we really would love for folks to stay and make sure that they fill out that evaluation so that we can gain feedback and learn about how we might offer some future sessions. Now I'll share a little bit about our group agreements, and we just want to share with everyone that is with us today, as well as ourselves as panelists and presenters, thinking about what it means to be in this space with one another. And so we encourage you to first to stay engaged, and whatever that means for you, and being comfortable and being in the right mindset to absorb and critically engage in the information. And then we also want you to think about speaking your truth. understanding that we all have come to this session with some biases and some perspectives, and just acknowledging that we all have those, but being able to take those in through a lens to hear the information that we're hearing today, and recognizing that sometimes that information might not align with the information that we already know, our own personal ideologies and beliefs, but really it's okay to experience discomfort in that and to continue your own learning and through that process. And so really, by the end of the session today, you might find that you actually have more questions and solutions, and that's okay, to expect and accept non-closure. So I just want to talk a little bit more today about what this session will focus on and why we are here and gathered today. And today what we're really going to focus on is how we will continue to explore how racism is both a public health and educational crisis. Yesterday's webinar, and I'm really excited if those of you are able to join us from yesterday as well, but yesterday's webinar focused on public health, and today we're going to focus in on education. Systemic inequities have really been built into our national education. And so today, what we're going to start is we're going to start with my colleague, Dr. Cynthia Reyes, and she's going to examine the history and the racial disparities of what is termed today as the pre-K through high school education system in America. This foundation is really critical in understanding how an already biased system operates in the context of a global pandemic. An important way to begin destructing and even understanding racial inequities is not being reliant on dominant cultural lenses and frameworks. And so my colleague, Dr. Lance Smith, will explore the importance of prioritizing education with non-dominant ideologies and frameworks, particularly, again, in the context of the pandemic. And then finally, my colleague, Paul Yoon, will offer some perspective on how current approaches to remote education, hybrid scheduling, and other educational modalities really have the potential to exacerbate inequities. In addition, Paul will share some more kind of personal knowledge and experience of what these inequities might look like tangibly. So today, really what we're seeking to do is offer a comprehensive view of racial inequities in education in America and how this is manifested into some of the disparities that are present in the midst of our educational climate today in the pandemic. As a nation, systemic approaches to both health as well as education have continued to be inequitable. As I was reminded yesterday in our webinar about public health that education is a social determinant of health, and thus education has important implications in decreasing health disparities along with other social determinants such as socioeconomic status, physical environment, employment, and some other factors as well. Myself, as a higher education researcher and practitioner, it has become increasingly evident to me, especially in the context of this pandemic, that education functions more as a private instead of a public good and is often framed as an individualistic instead of a collectivist mentality. The latter, a more collectivist mentality, if you will, emphasizes the idea that if every student is given an equitable instead of equal opportunity to learn, it is a benefit and a betterment to our society at large. It also centers families and communities as being essential to participating in the educational process. BIPOC students, first-generation students, multilingual students, students with disabilities, and other underrepresented student populations are expected to assimilate and to adapt to an educational system that historically and continues today to preclude equitable access and simply does not acknowledge many of the identities students hold as essential to their educational journeys. Our national educational system is structured on systems and perceptions of equality instead of equity. Today, I invite everyone to critically engage in being mindful of educational access and equity as you hear our panelists engage in topics which address racial disparities of education. So again, I'd like to introduce you all to our panelists that are with us today, and I'm excited to actually get to the content to hear what they have to share with us. And so I'll introduce each of them. First, we'll start with Dr. Cynthia Reyes. Dr. Reyes is an associate professor in the College of Education and Social Services, And her areas of expertise include, but are not limited to, educational policy, English language learners, immigrant and refugee populations, and social justice. Dr. Reyes will be followed by Dr. Lance Smith. Dr. Lance Smith is also an associate professor in the College of Education and Social Services. His areas of expertise include, but aren't limited to, clinical supervision, diversity, access, and equity, human development and identity, as well as mental health. And finally, we'll conclude with my colleague, Paul Yoon, advisor for strategic diversity assessment and research in the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and also as a vice chair on the President's Commission for Inclusive Excellence. And Paul's areas of expertise include, but are not limited to, strategic planning, cultural intelligence, and school administration. I'm so excited to begin with our first panelist, Dr. Cynthia Reyes.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So the purpose of my portion in this panel is to provide the lay of the land and examine the historical context of educational policy in the U.S. I have to admit it's quite intimidating because I need to shrink all of these important policies into 15 minutes. And so for all of you policy people, forgive me. But I think it is extremely important to go back and review some of these landmark historic cases that are meant to advance public school education for students and families who've been historically left out of making crucial decision making, especially as it pertains to their children, especially as it pertains to high quality schooling and educational conditions for their children. So it is huge. How do we talk about the impact of COVID-19 on all students and families? And so this opening will highlight an intersection of historical precedent and structural racism, as well as the importance of research that's relevant to the urgent needs of non-dominant students and families. Precedent is important, especially as we reflect on the rise in student protests, the increasing rise of the student protests, particularly children and youth who mobilized in the gun control protests, starting with the Majory High School students, and now students across the nation who are advocating for Black Lives Matter marches and raising of the Black Lives Matter flags in their schools across the nation. There certainly were precedents to these student protests, and I just want to identify two of them. For example, in 1917 in St. Louis, after a white mob lynched and killed 38 Black people and injured hundreds more, a group of American children, a group of 100 children dressed in white, symbolizing their innocence, led 10,000 African Americans in the silent parade through the streets of Manhattan, aimed at showing the American president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, as well as the public, the lawless treatment of Black Americans. And then years later, in 1963, 1,000 Black children skipped school to join the march for desegregating schools in Birmingham, Alabama, only to join the other adults, and they were also subjected to police spraying fire hoses and unleashing attack dogs. So the march was called the Children's Crusade, which mobilized the civil rights movement and led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I kind of want to really reinforce that theme of setting precedents in small cases and movements along the way that then become into these larger movements, which I think we'll see within all these panels. So these disparities should motivate us as a nation to address larger questions of the day, such as what should be the purpose of public school education today amidst this crisis? How do we reconcile historical educational landmark policies that were meant to narrow the gap and not widen them? And given the changing demographics of our nation, what is our moral obligation as a nation to invest rather than disinvest in public schools, which certainly has been happening for the last few decades? So disinvest in public schools that serve a majority of our nation's students. And I realize these questions are too big and complex to be answered today, but I offer them up as to reflect on as we listen today from the other panelists. Oh, thank you. So I want to set us up with two definitions and concepts. People have already started using non-dominant, and I'd like to define it. By non-dominant, I follow this academic term that many scholars have used, and it is an academic term. I don't think that any community members would even use this, and so I kind of want to name what we're talking about. We're talking in academic language right now, which is so removed from what's happening in the communities. But non-dominant is a term that I use from Gutierrez and Rogoff and Ishimaru and others to highlight the role of power in the dynamics of marginalization by dominant institutions, policies, and practices. And so although their experiences are unique in their own, low-income communities, those from immigrant or refugee backgrounds, children with disabilities, and communities of color do share experiences. And the common experience that they have is that they've been poorly served by dominant educational systems. Please change. So with regard to, here's the other definition. With regard to addressing systemic racism in the field of education and in the schools, I use a model from the National Equity Project that looks at how the benefits and burdens of society are distributed unequally. And this is reflected in a system where institutional systems that we all rely on, such as school, the criminal justice system, the healthcare, hospital, and housing, when you couple all of those systems with implicit bias, they work dynamically to keep inequities in place. So when I describe implicit bias can be very powerful because it is an unconscious response that can be primed by some association to image, sound, or word, but it can also be associated to beliefs, views, and feelings about others. And so when you combine these two, implicit bias and structural racism, it helps us to understand that in order to make progress on equity in the school system, we need to reduce our own biases as well as change the structures. We can't do one without the other. So for example, the way we fund schools is an example where inequities does happen because we know that students living in affluent communities attend highly resourced schools with extensive opportunities. And students living in neighborhoods in which we have disinvested attend schools that are underfunded. So, this model really comes alive for me when I think about my early years in teaching, when I had an opportunity to teach 3 years in a private school, grades K through 12. And it was very affluent. It was in Chicago, and it was about less than a mile from the lake. It was on this grassy knoll. It was about 2 to 3 blocks from Lincoln Park Zoo in this beautiful garden. And it was quite a shock, as a young teacher in her 20s, to then switch and go into a public school. And on the first day that I went in, the first thing that the principal told me was to make sure that my car was parked inside the gated parking lot. And so that was interesting to me to actually experience even some of the more deficit viewpoints that, that colleagues and administrators that I worked with in the ways that they talked about the students. And so would love to share that more later during the Q&A, but that's a personal experience to this model. The next slide, please. So a cornerstone of the civil rights movement, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, and it fought to strike down Plessy versus Fergus and Jim Crow laws that established this separate but equal doctrine. And there were 4 cases that were involved in this, and one of them involved a minister who sued his school district in Topeka because it wouldn't allow their daughter, Linda, to go into an all-white elementary school. And then there was a mother who sued her school district in Delaware because the high school wouldn't allow her daughter Shirley to attend this all-white high school. And so that's very important to understand that that is a precedent. Now there's a lesser well-known case that I read in a book called Water, Tossing Boulders, that described a case called Lum versus Rice, which involved a family of Chinese immigrants who lived in Mississippi in 1927, who sued the Rosedale County School District for not allowing their 2 daughters to attend the all-white elementary school. And it went all the way to the Mississippi Supreme Court, but at the time the court ruled in favor of the school district, saying that their policies did not violate the 14th Amendment. And so, the 14th Amendment addresses all aspects related to immigration and citizenship. And many of the many of the court cases that followed really relied on the 14th Amendment in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so it really wasn't until Brown versus Board that Lum v. Wright, they returned to it, and it was eventually overturned. And so again, I just want to build this idea that small cases, small movements, mobilize until it's a large movement. And so on to the next slide, please. So we have 2 significant civil rights laws, and there are many others, but I think there's two that we really need to talk about. And the first one is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was formerly called No Child Left Behind and is now called Every Student Succeeds Act. And then the second law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, of 2004. And actually, this is the current term. It was formerly called Education for All Handicapped Children when it was signed into law in 1975. And so these two laws are major. And why is that? That's because the first one, it's aimed to battle poverty, to enhance schooling opportunities for students living in poverty. And so when the National Center for Education Studies put out that about 64% or 14.9 million children receive Title I funds. And Title I is the source that's used for the federal government to send to the state schools to give them the funding. And so when you think about that, 14.9 million children, that's about 58% of public schools across the nation that receive Title I funds. So 4 years after it became a law, the NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, did a study on how schools were using the Title I. This is 4 years later, and the report found grievous misuses of the funds in many of the school districts. For example, one superintendent in a Mississippi school admitted in federal court that the schools serving Black students who were receiving the highest per pupil expenditure, and that means, government expenditure, how much money was spent on that pupil, in his school district was actually half of the lowest per pupil expenditure in schools serving white students. And so really reflecting on that report showed a disparity in that schools serving Black students were already being underserved. I mean, they were already behind the schools serving white students related to how much was spent on those students. So the funding that schools received through the ESSA Act was meant to supplement, not supplant, which is why they had to write that clause into the revised law to say, look, you need to provide these additional resources. They're additional resources to close the gap. They're not used to supplant or to be in place of school funding. But unfortunately, more than 40 years have passed, and our nation still hasn't achieved the law's original promise of providing all students with equitable access to educational resources, because we're still very behind in many states. Now, IDEA, on the other hand, about 7 million students, or 14% of all public school students, receive funding from IDEA. And based on a report from the National Council on Disability, one major thing, there are two things I want to share here. One major thing to remember about IDEA is that originally the federal government promised states it would provide 40% of the average per pupil expenditure to help offset the cost of educating students who were eligible for that program. That has never transpired in the last 43 years since it became law. The failure of Congress to provide adequate federal funding has placed all the burden on states and local school districts, to offset the cost. Another trend, according to a report from Child Trends, students of color, and actually according to my other colleagues who are experts in this field, students of color are also disproportionately overrepresented among children with disabilities. Black students, for example, are 40% more likely, and Native American students are 70% more likely to be identified for certain categories of disabilities than their peers. So really, the overrepresentation really depends on the type of disability. For example, Black students are more likely to be identified as having emotional disturbance and intellectual disability as their peers, and Native American students are apt to be identified as having developmental delays. This complexity also reflects an intersection between racism and ableism. For example, it's reflecting in disability, race, and suspension, such that in a single year, 1 in 5 Black, Native American, and multicultural boys with disabilities, which is 12%, are twice as likely as their peers without disabilities, which is 5%, to receive at least one out-of-school suspension. And so I have colleagues who write about this, and they're included in the set of power in the slides at the end of this presentation. But I have colleagues who write that suspension from school is usually associated with an increased risk of dropout, grade retention, and some form of contact with the juvenile justice system. In her work with disabled girls of color, someone that I've been following closely, Dr. Subini Anama, looks at the intersection of disabled Black girls who are suspended at rates higher than white boys, and similar to boys of color are being fed into what she refers to as the school-prison nexus. I mean, these are very bleak data, but really important to be reflecting and examining it at this time. And so the idea from this slide really is, if we return to the implicit bias and the structural racism model that I showed earlier, it would be useful for schools, teachers, and even community members, because community members vote on school budgets and they give input for schools, to look at some of these data and then ask themselves some really hard questions about how a student's social class, gender, race, ethnicity, or linguistic ability may somehow be informing the way we make crucial decisions about how our students learn in school and what they need to be able to succeed. Slide, please. So this slide pertains to the connection between policy and research. There are obviously more federal policies that followed after Brown versus Board, and I would like to use the term intersectional lens. And so first I need to pay homage to this concept, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminist work, which allows all of us to understand how categories of race, social class, gender, ableism, or sexual orientation, when applied to an individual or a group of people, they overlap and they work dynamically together to create discrimination or disadvantage. They also expose multiple sources of oppression. And so, so all of these significant educational policies are also milestones in the way that they were amended to the ESSA. So after Brown versus Board, a tidal wave of these court cases happened, and some turned into laws that aim to establish more equitable schooling opportunities for Native Americans. Lau versus Nichols relates to English language learners, education for all handicapped children with disabilities. Plyler versus Doe is for children who are undocumented, students who are undocumented. Title IX and Safe Schools then would be with the LGBTQ community, sexual orientation and gender. And so all of these, going back to precedent, it's really important to look at how policies and research are also related. And that's why it's really important to note some of the work that my colleagues are doing to emphasize the need for these policies, and whose work I've included. Some of the work that they've been doing relate to ethical issues related to counseling programs housed within religious institutions that disavow students with diverse sexual orientations. Colleagues from special education have published really a substantive amount of work based on policies and practices in state and out of state. And regarding intersectionality, I have a colleague who's published on the intersectionality between discrimination and bullying, another who has written about the retention of queer and trans undergraduate students, the influence of restorative practices to reduce discipline disparities among youth with disabilities and youth with color, opportunity structures for Latino students in higher education, and the importance of family and professional partnerships, particularly with immigrant and refugee families. So schools rely on all of this data. They also rely on this relevant research, which is why I put policies and research together, because we don't want to do what the panelists yesterday said, botching, education, and racism. And so I really love the term that he used, botching. Really important to understand exactly what the families need. That's why we need to use an intersectional lens so that we are not putting these groups in a monolithic group and making determinations about that group. So, lens, please. Sorry, the slide, please. I think the last, second to the last slide is a slide that pertains to data published by the Urban Institute, COVID-19's impact on economic impact by race and ethnicity. And I show this slide because it really would be a great way of starting. How do we look at this education short-term and long-term impact on learning? And so the Household Pulse survey was conducted during a specific period of time related to household experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the data that's disseminated here is disseminated in real time. On the left side of this graph, the percentages, which go from 0 to 60%, represent the share of adults in households where at least one of the adults lost employment. And at the bottom is a horizontal line spanning, which represents the span of time during which the data was collected from April 23, when all the schools and everything started to shut down, to June 9. So the data compares Black households, which is represented by the yellow bar, Latino, represented by the black bar, and the blue bar represents the national average of all other households. And so I don't think, the visual already clearly shows you that the households has the most share of families who have lost employment and who they are, which would be the Latinx and Black. And usually the experience was, and this is what adults reported, they were usually put on furlough or they got sick, and then they eventually lost their jobs. And so connected to this data is the longer-term impact of COVID-19, which will, not may, but will result in loss of learning, can produce a domino effect. I mean, we have 56 million students in public and private in the US out of school, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so when they all return in the fall or whenever, they return, there will be some who will already have been academically behind, and they'll continue to fall behind. And so, I draw upon a New York Times report on June 10th, which looked at some of these estimates and looked at some data. I also looked at a McKinsey report analysis. And again, this is just an analysis. And it's an analysis that's based on what would happen if students went back to school in January, not in September. And what they decided was that the average student could fall 7 months behind academically, while Black and Latinx students could experience even greater learning losses, equivalent to 10 months for Black children and 9 months for Latinx students. So I'll leave you with this one last piece that I think is super important when we think about structural racism in education. Any lack of effort, this is something that I read in one of the news reports, any lack of effort on the part of families does not contribute to the disparity in educational progress of students. For example, the poorest parents spent about the same amount of time during the school closures assisting their children with learning. That was about 13 hours a week. And they spent as much time as those in households making over $200,000 per year. And this was according to a May Census Bureau survey of households with children. And so what these disparities indeed do show us, it's not so much, the lack of effort. It shows what are the external factors that is keeping children from moving and their families from getting the kind of high quality schooling that they need. And so when we think about COVID-19 and everyone's going back to school, let's think about how these disparities do more with the quality, and what do they have to do with the quality of distance teaching and access to sustained high quality internet connection. And so these will be things that my other panelists will be talking about. Last slide, please. I'll just mention that this is for the Q&A. We'll be talking more about how are states addressing this. I mean, on a national level, we don't really have a standard movement. And so we have to depend on what each state is doing. And in our own state, we are seeing some kind of movement based on student agency, based on school personnel agency, and based on the community agency. And so thank you very much. I look forward to listening to my other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And so next we're going to hear from Dr. Lance Smith. Ready to go when you are, Lance.
Now well-shaven face into this space right here, but I'm up in the mountains in a rural area, and I simply lack the technology in this moment to do that. And it's not lost on me that my experience right now is what so many economically marginalized students are having, right, during this COVID experience. But here's what I want to talk about today. How nice white people like myself, and frankly, virtually every white person that I know and adore, how we perpetuate white supremacy in education. And when I use the language white supremacy, I'm not talking about white supremacist groups, the overt hate groups, KKK, the neo-Nazis. What I'm talking about is the predictive, disproportional white dominance throughout every aspect of education in our society, whether that's smaller classroom sizes, whether that's graduation rates, as Cynthia already mentioned, whether that's disproportional rates of suspension for Black and brown children. It's that type of white dominance in education for which I use the term white supremacy. And we could look at white supremacy and how nice white people like myself are complicit in that through multiple lenses. But we're going to use two lenses today. We're specifically going to unpack the white supremacist school funding model and the preeminence of white cultural capital in schools. So Paul, if you'll take us to the next one. So when I talk about the white supremacist school funding model, At the individual level, the average white student in the United States of America today receives more than $2,000 in funding over the average black and brown student in the United States today, and Cynthia has already alluded to this. So when you take those averages at the individual level and you push them out into the national level, what we see is that school districts that serve predominantly white students receive $23 billion more in funding than districts that serve the same number of black and brown students. So that's $23 billion more to build secure, inviting facilities, $23 billion more to advance their curriculum, $23 billion more to construct the technological infrastructure that we need more than ever right now during the COVID pandemic. And as Cynthia alluded to, public school systems throughout the nation are woefully underfunded. There's been a disinvestment in public school funding over the past 30 years, and this disinvestment hits black and brown children much harder than it hits white children. And I want to make this personal now. So Paul, if you'll take us to the next slide. Oftentimes we talk about disparities with numbers and graphs. I want to introduce you to my 5-year-old who'll be headed into kindergarten this fall. And that's his picture on the left from just a few days ago. And then I want to ask this question specifically to the nice, good white folks like myself who are participating today. Why does he deserve? Why do other white 5-year-olds like him deserve such a significant increase in school funding compared to black and 5-year-olds who are entering kindergarten this fall? And when I ask that question in class, this is where the cognitive dissonance really hits in for a majority of my students. And the response that I usually receive at this moment is something like, you know, Lance, I just don't, it's not a matter of who deserves funding, who doesn't. Lance, it's a matter of how schools are funded. So let's talk about how schools are funded at the local level, which then takes us to these other images on the slide. You see, Lance, your son, when he was a baby, he was born into an economically secure, well-resourced neighborhood. And that's why he has access to a better resource school than many black and brown children. And then when we ask the next question, well, why is that? And the myth in our culture, this myth that's built on meritocracy and individualism, and what goes unsaid in polite circles of nice white people, is that my son will receive better funding and education because of the choices that I made and because of the work ethic that I've engaged in over my professional life. And then, therefore, what is implied is that black and brown parents of 5-year-olds entering kindergarten this fall, they made bad decisions with regards to their educational trajectory in their life. They don't work as hard as white people do. Ultimately, they care less about the education of their children than we in white communities do. And not only is that patently racist, as Cynthia just alluded to, it's patently false, because far more significant than any individual decision that I have ever made that results in my children attending predominantly white schools that are better funded, far more significant is the script that was written by racist policies generations ago that have catapulted not just my kids, but a majority of white children in predominantly white schools into better funded schools. So Paul, if you'll move to the next slide. The script that I'm talking about is this. So in my lineage, most of my ancestors in the 19th century, early 20th century were very poor. They had very little economic security, no economic mobility. Then World War II came about, and when they came home from World War II, they came home still poor. They came home uneducated. None of my grandparents had even a high school education, but they came home to the Federal Housing Administration that was offering low-interest mortgages to white men like my grandfather. And these low-interest mortgages were racially coded so that they were denied to a majority of black men who were returning from World War II. And my grandfathers were also offered a GI Bill that was racially coded to push funding towards them that they could use for education and housing. My grandfather was also able to enter into the Social Security system that was also racially coded against black men of his generation. And so he took that economic capital. He was able to buy his first house, and of course he was redlined into an all-white neighborhood that was economically secure. And then we see this cycle start to happen, because within those neighborhoods, well-funded, better-funded schools were established. Within those schools, his children received a solid K-12 education. They then went on to college, where they graduated from all white, if not predominantly white, colleges. They then entered the salary class. They then began to amass wealth, and then they moved into neighborhoods and purchased homes themselves in affluent neighborhoods, and therefore my generation comes along. We do the same thing, and now we see this cycle, right? This cycle that was designed for white families to improve the wealth of the white lower class into the white middle class, and was intended to deny wealth and economic mobility and security to black and brown families. So that explains what we can see at the lower left-hand side of the slide. The racial wealth gap, whereas in 2016, the median wealth of white families is $143,000, for black and brown families is $12,000, and we can see over the past 30 years, white family wealth has increased somewhat, not as much as the 1% for sure, but the median white family increase in wealth is 14%, whereas for black and brown families it's a decline of 75%. So this is the white supremacist school funding model. And white people like myself, when we ignore this model that advances white children's education over the education of black and brown children, when we refrain from disrupting the system, then we ourselves are complicit in racism and in white supremacy. The next slide, Paul. Thank you. And certainly right now, it's probably self-evident that this funding model, plus what's happening with remote learning, hybrid schedules during this time of pandemic, is only going to increase white supremacy in education, which Cynthia has already underscored. And it's just so clear, right? Schools that are better funded have more resources to build the technological infrastructure that is so necessary during online learning. They have more resources to access all of the additional human resources that they need within schools. And because white folks dominate the salary class, we are more likely to have flexibility in our professions, wherein we can stay home and provide childcare. We have more flexibility in our schedules, where we can advocate for the needs of our children. So this white supremacist economic system and the white supremacist school funding model is only going to exacerbate inequities in education. And now we'll move to the second point, Paul, that I want to briefly address. And that's white cultural capital in schools. So first, let's define cultural capital. Cultural capital is the social and cultural knowledge, tastes, habits, and norms of the dominant group in any society that are most rewarded in that society's schools. And in our society, because whiteness is the dominant form of cultural capital in our schools, my children have internalized whiteness and white cultural capital. And what that looks like is, I'm just going to draw out 3 specific constructs that connect to white cultural capital, and that's perfectionism, individualism, and urgency. So perfectionism, this is often underscored in our school systems. We reward students who have perfect attendance, right? We all remember getting stickers, or some of us do, maybe not all of us, when we earned a perfect score on our spelling test. We may not overtly state that we are constantly pushing for perfection, but that's the unstated norm within our school systems. Individualism, as Cynthia has already mentioned, is a prominent value within our school systems. We evaluate our children not on within groups. We're not as concerned with the collective. We significantly emphasize what's happening individually with our children. And finally, this sense of urgency within white culture. We must get to class on time before the bell rings. Our children must enroll in the electives that are so imperative for their future growth and development. It's very urgent that we get into our top-tier colleges and not our second-tier colleges, right? So there's this palpable sense of urgency that is constantly operating within white school systems. And while my children, who have internalized white cultural capital, as have I, While this comes organically to them and it fosters their movement through school systems, this isn't necessarily the case for minoritized children and or children from non-dominant cultures. Paul, if you'll take us to the next slide. So scholars of color for decades now have brought to our attention the idea that cultural capital is different depending on the community in which to which we are speaking. So, for example, 4 components of cultural capital for minoritized communities of color. One is aspirational capital, the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future. And you can see how this was necessary and honed through 400 years of oppression, why this would be so vital to students of color. And as well, familial capital, connections to and acknowledgement of family and kinship networks, the emphasis on the collective over the individual. Navigational capital, the ability to navigate through schooling and other institutions that were not designed with communities of color in mind. And I want to emphasize, as we wrap up my portion of the talk, resistance capital. And this is knowledge of and motivation to transform oppressive cultures. And in the literature, we see resistance capital also in Paulo Freire's idea of critical consciousness, developing the consciousness of institutional oppression, such as structural racism, and the empowerment to disrupt those systems. We also see it more recently in Paul Gorski's work of equity literacy. So if we can move to the next slide, Paul. There's an exciting body of literature that's developing within education that is actually measuring the effects of resistance capital or critical consciousness within children of color, specifically black and brown children. And I highlight just one study. This study came out in Child Development last year from researchers in Boston College and Harvard University. The N was around 384, I believe, and this was a longitudinal study that looked at students from 8th grade until they graduated. And what this study found was that black and brown students who enter high school with a high degree of resistance capital, that is, they have a very strong understanding of systemic oppression, systemic racism, and are empowered to act against it, they saw an effect on their SAT scores by the time they became juniors in high school. So middle school educators, middle school administrators, and parents, pay attention when we can emphasize resistance capital within the middle school. We are likely to see positive effects on SAT scores years later. This study also found that black and brown students whose resistance capital increases during high school positively affects an increase in their GPA. And I want to underscore, in the mental health literature, we've seen for years that critical consciousness, resistance capital, has a positive impact on the social and emotional well-being of oppressed communities. That's people of color, women, people who are negotiating poverty, people with disabilities, people who identify as gender fluid or gender non-binary. So we've seen the impact on mental health and emotional well-being, and now we're seeing it on academic development as well. So Paul, one more slide, I believe. But what happens when we're in the middle of crisis COVID pandemic learning? When schools are significantly stressed to deliver the curriculum that's considered core within white society, science, mathematics, language arts, other forms of, other curriculums such as ethnic studies, other curriculums that would inform resistance capital and critical consciousness tend to be neglected and or pushed to the side. We already do a pretty lousy job of infusing resistance capital curriculum into our schools. And when it is done, it's usually done after school. It's usually done as an elective. And that's not the priority of predominantly white schools that now find ourselves within a pandemic. So I want to leave us with one more idea. Paul, if you can take us to the last slide. I've been speaking specifically to nice, white, good people like myself. And I want to say that if we want to change, if we want to move away from being complicit and perpetuating white supremacy in education, what can we do to disrupt white supremacy in education. Specifically, two things I would like us to think about is how do we take action against the white supremacist school funding model? This would be a big legislative lift at the national and state level, but this work is an imperative. How do we move forward into that? And also, how can we bring our voices, how can we bring our cultural capital to actually infuse more non-dominant forms of cultural capital in the curriculum within our school systems? And Paul, I'm excited to hear about how you will speak more specifically to school inequities during this pandemic time of learning. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lance, for this great sharing your content, and I'm happy to share, and that will transition to our final panelist. Paul, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you so much to both Dr. Reyes and Dr. Smith. I'm sure we could have spent the rest of the time together just hearing from either one of you, so thank you both so much. Before I proceed, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge just all of the hardworking educators and administrators that are out there right now doing everything they can to develop comprehensive reopening plans that are backed by science. I am grateful for all that you are doing to keep our students, our educators, and families safe and healthy. In addition, I just wanted to acknowledge all the parents and guardians who are truly stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think it's safe to assume we all want students in our country to have equitable access to a high-quality education. However, for many, that decision to send them back or not is actually just simply a matter of life and death. And that is a really difficult place to be in. Finally, I also wanted to emphasize that context matters. So in short, Vermont is not equal to Florida, who currently is recording over 8,000 new cases per day of COVID-19, that is. All of us in this country are stuck between a rock and a hard place because we believe, or we should at least believe, that the health and safety of our fellow citizens across the country and also around the world is inextricably bound to our own health and safety. So context, again, matters greatly. In a similar way to Lance, I also wanted to kind of start in earnest today by candidly admitting to you that I do not have all of the answers. My family pictured here is struggling with how to navigate this complex situation. My wife is an educator who had to request a leave of absence from her school when our school district announced they would be following a hybrid schedule for the first part of the school year. My daughter, just like Lance's child, is due to start kindergarten in a few weeks, and our son is going to be going into 4th grade. So even with a few advanced degrees between us, a steady job, and a solid middle-class background, we are struggling to make sense of everything, and I hope you know that it is okay if you are too, because nobody has all of the answers right now. What I did want to come back to, though, was a quote that was shared with me as a young man. It was introduced to me, and it's actually, I had a poster of it that hung in my classroom when I was a teacher for my entire career, to remind my students of the importance of studying history when trying to understand systems of oppression. And thanks to Dr. Reyes, I'm not going to go into as much detail here as I might normally, but I wanted to re-emphasize one point that she made, that public education as an institution was intended to help level the playing field. Sadly, for much of our nation's history, that has not been true. And the pandemic has only exacerbated the disparities between affluent students and their families and historically marginalized students and their families. Because as Cynthia explained, and as Lance has explained as well, these disparities have existed for generations. So make no mistake, the impact of this pandemic will be generational unless we act together as anti-racists. So I also wanted to share with you a quote by Ibram Kendi. I'm not going to read the whole quote here for you, but I hope that you've had the opportunity to, if not watch, then at least see our 3-part series on systemic racism, which describe the racial predictability and disproportionality of which people in the US have access to things like a high-quality public or private education. And that systemic racism has normalized something, what we're seeing right now, and it's frankly very difficult for us to even see this. So without going into too much depth into Abrams' work, I just wanted to share a part of this quote from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a to be preserved, as a racist, or confronts racial inequalities as an anti-racist. And I'm going to try to come back to that point several times, that either, again, we allow these racial inequities to continue, or we confront them as anti-racists. I also wanted to just shout out, as Tiffanie did earlier, the incredible session yesterday that was put on by our colleagues at the Larner College of Medicine. And if you haven't had an opportunity to watch that, I do encourage you to watch it as soon as we get it up. Because my colleague, Dr. Jan Carney, did a phenomenal job of talking about racism as a public health emergency or crisis. And this infographic, the Lifetime of Inequality infographic, comes from the National Geographic magazine. And in that infographic, if you look at some parts of it in detail, it shows that BIPOC people in our country, particularly Black and Latinx people, right, face a lifetime of inequalities. And these inequalities shape their experience from life, right, all the way to death. And again, each of us must choose whether we're going to allow a system that produces these inequalities to persevere, or if we're going to confront them. And I thought it would be helpful to illustrate in a little bit more concrete detail just kind of what these inequities look like. So instead of talking about big kind of macro level issues, I thought it might be helpful for us, as I shift back to talking about schools, for us to just examine a short case study, a part of a conversation about reopening plans. So in one private school reopening plan I read about recently, and I have a disclaimer here, this was the school that I attended for 10 years as a pre-K through 8 student. So I do have a little bit of personal experience with this community. These are selected highlights of what these students will be going back to in just a few short weeks. In-person instruction 5 days a week. Pod sizes of between 7 and 13 students to every teacher. A sophisticated bipolar ionization system. And I didn't know what that was either, so I had to look it up. It's a system that, quote unquote, utilizes specialized tubes that take oxygen molecules from the air and converts them into charged atoms that then cluster around things like airborne mold, bacteria, and allergens, and most importantly, viruses. And it actually circulates the air 3 times every hour within a room. And this school, right, said that should a student be learning remotely, either by choice or due to sickness, all of their classes are going to be live streamed every day so students can access them whether they are in school or not, because of choice or because they might be sick that particular day. So let's look at the other side of the coin here at other public schools, and in this particular case, in New York City public schools. So by contrast, right, there are 1.1 million students in the New York City public school system. And the new school year, which is just a few weeks away, still remains up in the air. Students in these schools may, and there's a big asterisk next to that because they have not actually announced what those plans are going to be yet, may only be able to access 1 to 3 days of in-person instruction. Classes, again, are going to vary in size across the city, but will undoubtedly be higher than the previous plan, which, right, then puts students, educators, and their families at higher risk of COVID transmission. Many of these schools already had substandard air quality before the pandemic, and this is not likely to be fixed before the beginning of the school year. And of course, parents and guardians are going to need to figure out how to care for these students during the week when they're not in school, right, to say the least. So in a recent article that I read from the New York Times, one educational administrator said the comparison between independent and public schools is like comparing a large cargo ship with the nimbleness of a small sailboat. And yet, I don't think it takes an advanced degree to understand that when we talk about how the pandemic is going to exacerbate inequities and widen the achievement gap for millions of students across our country along many intersecting lines, we are talking about something that has, again, generational implications. So, Paul, given all the givens, right, what are some solutions that are out there? How can we, right, not perpetuate these inequities? I'm so happy that you asked that question. So recently, a broad group of educators and health experts have argued that young children should be the first ones to go back into classrooms, partly because if a child doesn't learn how to read, write, and handle numbers, they may struggle for the rest of their life. And as a practical matter, many children can't log themselves into a computer or learn independently. In addition, there are both economic and practical implications to consider when we're thinking about these types of solutions. So when children learn at home, often they need adults nearby to assist them. And for those of you who experienced what we experienced this past spring, we know how true that is. Affluent families, yes, can go out and form pandemic pods. They could hire private tutors or simply just hire people to help with childcare during the day. But unfortunately, that's just not a reality that most people can afford, at least not in our country. And so as we all consider solutions, I want to encourage you to ask yourself this question. Will this decision, whether it's a decision that I am making personally for myself or for the organization that I am representing, is this decision likely impacting some of our community members disproportionately and setting us as a community back? If the answer is yes, I encourage you to pause and consider how your solutions, again, whether they're for yourselves or for your institutions, can be tweaked with equity in mind. But that question in and of itself is an important one to ask whenever making these types of decisions. In addition, I wanted you to think about some of these supportive actions. The whole point of this webinar series is also to try to be as action-oriented as possible. And I do want you to know that there are some things that you can do. So in addition to at least some of those solutions that I proposed in the previous slide, I encourage you, both as an individual and as representatives from organizations, to consider these supportive actions. To please be equity-minded, particularly, as I just said, as you make difficult decisions for yourself and your organization. To be human-focused. Check in and ensure that the people you know and that you care for know they are cared about and that they, again, are okay. Mental health, especially during this time, is just as important, if not potentially more important, than our physical health as well. I want you to really also encourage to focus on learning that occurs as you grapple with these challenges. For example, if you are hyper-focused on getting X% of your school's students to attend in-person school by September 8th, you may not realize until it's too late that you have not done enough to make sure students even feel safe attending your school, no matter the plan. I also encourage you to hold not only yourselves accountable, but also people like our local school administrators and others in our community. Ask, are they keeping equity in mind as they make decisions about what school is going to look like pre-K through 16, starting in just a few weeks? Finally, I wanted to reiterate a point that Dr. Smith made earlier. Think about work to infuse schools with non-dominant cultural capital. So as he explained already, there's a growing body of work that shows the positive impact this could have on students, particularly BIPOC students, and I also believe it would have ancillary benefits to other community members as well. So I went through a lot of ground here, so I wanted to just take a minute to review a few of my key points. First of all, I wanted to again re-acknowledge that we're all stuck between a rock and a hard place, whether we like it or not. I believe the health and safety of our fellow citizens is inextricably bound to my own health, and I hope that you will as well. That history is best suited to reward our research. If you don't know how we've gotten here, I encourage you to learn this history. The internal work of understanding how systems of oppression have impacted us is a prerequisite for any anti-racist action. We need people at all stages and across all people's lives to disrupt systems to help change systems and make them more equitable. There is work to be done everywhere. And finally, there is no safe space. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. You are either actively anti-racist or racist. So, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your questions and answering some of them alongside my colleagues, Cynthia and Lance.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really enjoyed all three of our panelists, and now we would really love to transition into our Q&A. I'm just going to start by asking some questions for each of the panelists. And so, Dr. Reyes, if I could just start with you. I'm curious, you really shared a lot with us about some of the kind of vast systemic inequities and talked about implicit bias and structural racism, for example. So can you offer us a suggestion or maybe a comment of how we can kind of use some of the current time to leverage some emerging policies to fight inequities while still being kind of mindful of these past systemic issues that exist?
That's a tough question. But I think there is movement, right? I mean, exactly what Paul was talking about. In terms of policy, I mean, I think Lance said legislation. There are people that are mobilizing to do certain things. For example, just last year in Vermont, the group, the Vermont Coalition and Equity Studies, the Vermont Coalition for Ethnic Studies and Social Equity in Schools, were able to pass Act 1, which is a law, ethnic studies. And so it developed a working group, of which I'm a part of, and it's recommending updates and additional standards to the State Board of Education and recognizing fully, you know, so that we can recognize fully the history, contributions, and perspectives of ethnic groups and social groups. And so that's one example where we're looking at, and we're working collaboratively too with the Vermont Agency of Education, and looking at curriculum and hopefully looking at standards. We're in that planning stage right now and trying to create a tool that will enable us to go to different school districts and to invite school districts to look at this tool and to look at their own internal self-reflection, right? To see what is it that they're missing, you know, what are the sorts of histories of communities that are absent in their curriculum. And so that's one example. I mean, I think just another example is some of the work that's already happening in schools in terms of, and again, this relates to what Paul is already talking about and Lance as well, that teachers and school personnel, they're looking at, so there's a type of teacher identity development going on where people are doing more reading and more education, self-education about some of their own implicit biases and learning some of the language so that people can use a collective language that everyone can understand and use. And this actually is also going hand in hand with some of the work that students themselves, students who are speaking out. I mean, just recently in Winooski School District, right, there were the students who had written a letter to the local school board asking, I think they had about 15 asks, and this is very similar to what, you know, UVM students also a few years ago did, going to the administration with a list of asks, you know, trying to find, trying to ask us to improve the way we teach our curriculum, especially related to race and racism courses. And so I think everything, you know, things that are converging at the grassroots level too is very, very powerful. So I'll just stop right there because I know there's lots of other things that people might want to say.
That's great. Thank you, Cynthia. I really love that example, especially at the end about the students at Winooski. I think students are a really pivotal piece of thinking about how we approach education and what they think of how we should be approaching things. Dr. Smith, if I could ask you a similar question, but thinking about the content you shared with us some of your frameworks that talk about white supremacy and resistance and non-dominant kind of cultural capital. Could you share what you think might be a suggestion as to how we can use this current time to leverage emerging policies to fight inequities?
Yeah, and Cynthia, you always allude to all the good stuff. I love following you because I can just say what Cynthia said. The research team that I've been involved with for the past 3 years one of our primary objectives has been to work within schools to aid administrators and teachers in developing structures that surface student voice. When students, primarily Black and brown students, BIPOC students, when they are supported, when they have the structure to speak their
I think we might have lost Dr. Smith, so we'll come back to him and have him continue to answer some of our questions and answers. But now I'm just going to throw a question out to Paul, if you don't mind. Paul, we've really enjoyed listening. Well, I especially really enjoyed listening about some of the ideas that you offered and hearing a little bit about your own kind of personal story about how what we're living through currently impacts you and your family. And I just wondered if you could share with us kind of an example that you think is an equity-minded approach that kind of deals with what's going on right now. What are some ideas that maybe you've heard of or that you can share of what teachers, parents, families might think about and kind of use an equity-minded approach?
I think that's an extremely important question to be asking, so thank you for asking it. And I think that the good thing is that having an equity-minded orientation is not something that is for just one group of individuals. This is something that a student, a parent or guardian, an educator, a community member, an administrator, all of these different people, I think, can share that kind of orientation. I can tell you that one kind of concrete thing that we're thinking about as we look at what this upcoming school year is going to be is thinking about, as our children go into this hybrid model, thinking about what we're going to be able to do to support those other students that are in our child's classrooms outside, again, of their particular pod. In the sense that, are there ways in which we can, as families, just, again, continue to connect our child with other students in other classes or even within his or her own classroom, and to think about ways, again, for especially, again, as we were talking about earlier, those students that, again, might be historically marginalized in some particular way, how can we make sure that if they might not have those social connections to other families that would enable them to be connected with a quote-unquote pandemic pod, how can we make sure that we're going out and reaching out so that these families and these students in particular have those options too? Again, our family is uniquely situated to be able to provide that, as, again, having a family of two licensed, quote-unquote, highly qualified educators. So we find ourselves kind of thinking about, well, what are the things that for us are assets that we can then leverage to support other students and families? And that is also kind of the other piece of what I wanted to just say is that, as I said earlier, the work is everywhere. I sure as heck don't have any skills in things like carpentry, for example, but there might be a need for hands-on projects that need, again, people with those types of skills. And I just kind of say that in a cheeky way, but I just mean that all of us have strengths, and figuring out how to leverage those with an equity mindset, I think in particular during this time is going to be even more important. So that's an answer to that question for now.
Thanks, Paul. I love that example. And so now I hope we still have Lance with us, but we're just going to go ahead and begin with some of the questions from our audience members. And I think this question could be answered by any of our panelists. So if any of you all just want to jump in, we have a question from our colleague, Dr. Jane O'Ketch, and she says, I find hope and fortitude in supportive actions. How do we continue to strengthen those who are in the margins, those who are discouraged and scared for their children to stay engaged and hopeful?
I can jump in and start because I think that's a really extremely important question. And I and a colleague have been working specifically with families, mostly families with refugee experiences. And so I have a couple of examples. And the first is, in our work with families, we're very interested in partnering families with schools. And I think, I'm thinking about the second part of that question, those who are discouraged and scared for their children to stay engaged and hopeful. And I think our responsibility and commitment to these families as educational researchers, as community members, is to find a way to help and bridge a connection between schools and families with that's very respectful and that doesn't have any assumptions about how families are. That's also drawing upon some of the funds of knowledge or resources that families themselves have, to respect that some families have very efficient networks and systems that work and that we don't have to change them. And I'm speaking from, and I've been a teacher, so, I also respect a lot of the work that teachers and administrators have been doing in school districts, but I think it's really difficult when we have language that's in policy, for example, that talks about family involvement, for example. Involvement usually means inviting parents to a parent-teacher conference, and that's it. It only has something to do with something that families need to do in order for their children to succeed. Instead, we should change the term involvement to partnering, and helping families see some of what they already have is something that they can bring into the school and enrich, their children and enrich the school with what they know. And so I think it's, how do we keep families from becoming discouraged, those people who are marginalized? It's really about creating confidence in relationships between schools and families and between children, some of whom really don't trust, some families don't trust the schools. And there's a lot of research that backs this up. And so I think, again, as schools, and some schools are doing that already, but I don't want to talk. The second example I was just going to say was teachers again. Teachers in working on their own implicit bias, and certainly I've, being an early teacher and having this experience of having worked in a private, very affluent school and then jumping into a public school and certainly having my own assumptions, and the things that I had to do to be able to gain the child's trust and the family's trust. And again, it seems like I'm talking about things that are really abstract, but if you go into the research, these are very important values that need to be established so that there's trust, so that people can move forward.
Thanks, Cynthia. Now we have another question, and I guess I'll give this to Lance first, and maybe if you want to chime in first. How do we hold local, state, and national governments accountable to some of the inequities that we've talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a big one. What comes to mind for me, Juan, and I'm constantly thinking about nice white people like myself and the people that I adore and love that I'm surrounded with in my life. And I think in order for us to hold local, state, and national governments accountable, we need to move away from being allies to becoming co-conspirators in anti-racism work. We need to come off the bench and substantively get in the anti-racism.
Unfortunately, I think we've lost Dr. Smith again, so I'm going to, Paul, would you mind kind of jumping in and sharing your perspective?
Tag on in. Gosh, there was, I know Lance was about to give a fantastic answer to that particular question, and I do want to reemphasize one point he just made about that shift between being simply allies to co-conspirators, ... I hope he's able to come back to kind of finish that. Because what I like about that as well is it just goes back to a point that I made earlier about the agency that we have as individuals and what we can be doing in these types of situations to effect change. I truly believe that we, again, can do something, and while it might not be a huge thing, we all can do something. And so that kind of leads me into the answer for this question that I was thinking about, Juan, is first of all, I don't know if it's me being the son of immigrant parents and kind of not kind of knowing how America, I guess, as you can say, as a society really works, at least not because I don't have that cultural capital, that intellectual capital that's accumulated over generations. But what I have learned over the few decades of my life is the nuances at each level of how different kind of institutions work at the local, right, the state, and the national governmental level. And the thing that I would encourage people like you to be thinking about is, who are those people that can help you understand that? Or what are those resources you can find that are going to help you understand those nuances? Because there are things right here, I live in Essex, for example, that can be done at the local level, but it requires, right, a knowledge and understanding of our select board, of our school board, of other types of like structures and mechanisms for me to be able to, again, affect any change here at the local level. Similarly, as you go up to the state level, you really have to have a nuanced understanding of how our state government works. And again, I think that that is going to take, right, some education and learning so that you know where, right, those kind of pressure points or where those leverage points are, whether it's in our executive branch and with the governor, or whether it's with our senators and our House of Representatives, or something along those lines. And last but not least, again, obviously at the national level as well, a much more complex kind of big system, but similarly structured in some ways, just on a larger scale. And so again, where are those places that you as an individual can either work individually or with others to effect that change? Does Senator Leahy become your best friend that you have on speed dial and you're talking to him all the time? Are there other people, again, that are working at the national level that you'll be able to, again, pressure in some way to affect that change? So I'm going to pause here so we can get to some more questions.
Thanks, Paul. That was a seamless transition. So thanks for jumping in. Appreciate that. Now we have another question, and this question comes from Allison. Thanks for your question, Allison. And I'm going to address this question to Cynthia. Cynthia, can you share how do we support our special education students? Because you did mention a little bit about this in your presentation as well.
I did. I have to apologize. I mean, that's not my expertise, and I have so many colleagues who can speak so much better to that question. It's such a broad question. I work mostly with English language learners. However, it's interesting because there are intersectionalities between English learners who are often represented in classrooms, special education classrooms. Now, I know that there are many, at least when I see my colleagues, they work a lot with training with teachers. Professional development certainly is huge. How to work with teachers and how to find ways to pair up, for example, special educators and general education teachers. You know, this is something that we do with English learners, English language learner teachers as well. When they have so much specific expertise and general education teachers don't have that same expertise, finding ways for them to partner and to collaborate so that they are sort of aligned when they're providing services for special education students. And this is just sort of on top of what they need anyways, funding. Funding is always going to be an issue, right? And so, and because of the special, you know, sort of the special materials and tools and things that are needed to really provide high quality education for special education students. So there's professional development, you know, the instructional materials needed itself. And also, I would say the climate of the school in terms of how inclusive schools really are and whether schools really are following the policies under IDEA that they should be. And I would say that that is probably the highest priority. If they really want to support children with special needs, that they really need to be following the school districts need to follow these policies in order to deliver good education.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Tiffany, if I can.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you.
What Cynthia was just saying, the only thing I wanted to add to that was the mindset, encouraging the mindset in our general education and our special education educators that their students are their students as a team or as a unit, in the sense that unfortunately what I've seen in my experience as a school-based administrator is that some educators consider students that educators as students or that educators as students based on their, again, abilities. what I've seen is when educators, special educators and general educators, again, come together and, again, ask themselves, what is in the best interest of this particular student, and work together to figure out what that solution is when the best kind of product, if you will, comes out, the best support comes out. And that's a mindset that, again, unfortunately needs to continue to be cultivated because it's just not present everywhere at the moment.
Thanks, Paul. And now we just have time for one final question, and so I'm going to pose this question for you, Paul. It seems a critical part of figuring out in-person / remote / hybrid returning to school is childcare. Who should be tasked in supporting families with childcare? Schools.
So there was a quote that I read recently that really resonated with me about this. And it went something like this. It was talking about the nature of pandemics and why, in our case, a federal government, and in this particular question case, a state government, are so necessary. There is a reason that we as humans have created these systems of government to, again, effectively help everybody, especially when things like this occur. So whether, again, we're talking about a pandemic, a natural disaster, what have you, I do think in this case, our state government really should be helping to coordinate activities across the state with, of course, the Agency of Education, but with also other, whether it's early childhood care providers or other entities to try to figure this out. And it's only, unfortunately, right, the state government, at least in our case, that could do something like this, because there is nothing larger than that in the state of Vermont. And so I think, again, our state's pandemic response has been admirable. It's good to be here in Vermont compared to other places. And I think, again, with leadership and coordination from our state government level down, again, working with many different types of leaders across many sectors, that's, I think, at least with this particular problem, where these solutions could have happened. Sadly, right, we're bearing down on September 8th as the start of the academic year for our students, and obviously time is ticking. But hopefully, if this continues, right, through 2020 and into 2021, we do see a different, much more coordinated response, again, from the state kind of government level down.
Thank you, Paul. And so I just want to again thank everyone for being a part of the webinar today. We really enjoyed hosting everyone. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Wanda Heading Grant and the Office of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion for really visioning and imagining these series and really giving us the opportunity to be agents in how we think about responding to racial inequities and inequities at large. And so thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Wanda Heading Grant, for giving us the space to explore these topics in greater detail. Also want to give some thanks to CDE for helping to sponsor this. And again, I'm a part of the College of Education and Social Services. Also just to support the moderators who helped out today, and again our wonderful panelists who participated today. Thank you, Dr. Reyes, Dr. Smith, and Paul Yoon. We're really grateful for your expertise and the knowledge you shared with us today. And then also I just want to also mention again that I mentioned at the beginning that you have the opportunity to gain a digital badge, and you will be able to experience getting that badge if that's something that you feel would help in your resume or some other kind of social media or some kind of professional development for yourself. You're able to access getting a digital badge to recognize the knowledge that you've learned from this webinar. And so you'll be able to receive an email. We'll show an email. If you could just the next slide, Paul. So you can receive an email from admin@youracclaim.com, and that is how you can access your digital badge. And that's just another way, again, to recognize the information that you've learned today. And I also, again, want to mention that we do have an evaluation. We would love to hear your feedback on what was helpful, what hasn't been helpful, and maybe some topics that you might be interested in exploring in the future. Thank you again for your time today. We've really enjoyed hosting you, and I hope you'll continue to participate in the webinars. Have a great afternoon.